And we're thinking about freedom and determinism, and I wanted to go over some of the readings that I don't have other videos to help you with. And the first of those is Nishitani's um, article on fate from a Buddhist perspective, um, which, of course, is rooted in the idea of karma. And basically, what he's saying is that we, in a sense, we choose our own fate. We we act, and we act freely, but our actions then um, compel us. And so, in a way, we're free, and in a way, it's fate, but it's a fate made by ourselves. Um, we attach ourselves to self, to this world, and therefore we act in certain ways that only intensify our bondage. In essence, we are enslaved by our own desires, which then lead us to do things that are against our own ultimate well-being. That I choose to smoke, say. I then become addicted to nicotine, and I can't stop. It didn't have to be that way. There was a time when I could have chosen differently, but because I chose the way I did, now I can't break free. Um, and so freedom and causal necessity, he says, become one. Um, I made my choice, and I'm now stuck in the consequences. Not just with the consequences, but in them. My actions um, have led me to the place where I am, and now I'm enslaved by my own desires, my own choices, if you will. Now, another way of dealing with this, especially in the Middle Eastern religions, particularly Christianity and Islam, is the concept of predestination. I've got another video that talks about that in connection with Islam, but I want to talk a little bit about the readings from Augustine and Jonathan Edwards. Um, in the selection from Augustine, he's actually arguing the point of God giving us free will. And that basically no one can be good unless it is by choice. If I do the right thing, but it's because I had to do it, how good is that really? And so God gave us free will so that we could do right. Even though that also logically incurs the possibility that we would use that freedom to do wrong. But that, Augustine argues, was not God's intention. That in fact, as he puts it, when God punishes a sinner, does he not seem to say, why have you not used free will for the purpose for which I gave it to you, to act rightly? The purpose for which God gave us free will was so that we might do right. Now, because I've read more of Augustine than what you have in your book, I can also tell you that Augustine believes that God knows what choices we're going to make, because God is beyond space and time. And therefore, to God, every moment is always present. For us, there is past, there is present, there is future. But for God, every moment is always present. There is no time in the presence of God. That's a phenomenon that's limited to this world. And so, God knows what choices we're going to make, but that doesn't take away our freedom. That doesn't mean God is making us do those things. It's simply that he knows what we're going to do, because what for us is future isn't future to God. Every moment is present to God. And so it's foreknowledge, but it's not really predestination in the sense that Jonathan Edwards talks about it, where yes, of course, that God has foreknowledge of the actions of human beings. But he goes further than that. For Edwards, who is a follower of John Calvin, the concept of predestination is that God chooses who is going to be saved and who is going to be damned, and there is no reason other than his will. No one deserves it. It is an act of sheer mercy on God's part that he chooses some to be saved, and we cannot frustrate that desire on God's part. Those whom God chooses, he will bring to himself one way or another. You cannot escape God's calling. And those whom he calls, whom he chooses, he protects so that they cannot fall away. If it looks like somebody is a believer and then they fall away, some people use the word backslide, that only shows that they were never really among the chosen to begin with. That God's grace is irresistible. We do not, in fact, have free will. In Edwards or Calvin's viewpoint, it is, and this is rooted in a concept of the sovereignty of God. God is all-powerful. And it's also rooted, frankly, in a concept of human sinfulness. Basically, the idea is that if I have to do anything at all to make my salvation happen, I will mess it up. The only way that anyone could ever be saved is if God does absolutely everything that is necessary in order to make that happen, and that includes choosing who is going to be saved. There is no place for human freedom in Calvin's system or in Edwards's. Now, I skipped over in your book the idea in Yoruba religion of the people choosing their ori, their inner head. First of all, the word for what this story is based on in religious studies is myth. But myth in religious studies doesn't mean a false story. A myth in religious studies is a story in which the main characters are divine beings, and it is set in a special sacred time. By that definition, the most commonly recited myth in the Western world is one that, as a United Methodist minister, I have repeated many, many times. On the night in which he was betrayed, Jesus took bread, broke it, gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat." Okay, what makes that a myth by this technical definition? Well, it's a story about the actions of divine beings. In Christian theology, Jesus is not just another person. He is a unique God in human flesh. Okay? And the story takes place in a special sacred time, the time when God comes to earth in human form in order to effect the salvation of humankind. And that story sets a pattern that is reenacted through ritual by partaking in communion. In a way, the Christian participates in the saving death and resurrection of Jesus. And so that's kind of the way I look at this story. I mean, the point of it is that we choose our head, but we choose it without knowing the consequences. And in a way, that's a similar message, I think, to the play Oedipus, where as human beings we have to act. We have to make choices, decisions. But because we are human, we are always making our choices with limited knowledge. We cannot know all of the possible consequences of our actions. Oedipus in the story is running away from the fate that was ordained for him to kill his father and marry his mother. And so he leaves the only parents he's ever known, but there's something he doesn't know. And that is that they're not his biological parents. And so he winds up, in fact, as the other video explained to you, killing his father and marrying his mother. I think, and the lesson that I think we're to learn from that, if you take the Aristotelian theory of tragedy, which I think Oedipus fits very well, is that as human beings we have to make decisions, but we're always deciding based on limited knowledge, because human knowledge is always limited. That's part of the human condition. And I see that in this story. We choose our heads, but we don't know, the which heads are good and which heads are bad. We form our own character, but we don't do that aware of thinking about long-term consequences. We do it in the here and now of everyday life. We're we're struggling with understanding philosophy, and so we decide to take a shortcut, and we find an article that relates to one of the philosophers that we're supposed to talk about on Wikipedia or some other website, and we copy and paste, or we paraphrase from that. And we think we're getting ahead, but in reality, what we're doing is we're shortchanging ourselves, because we really don't come to understand the philosophy that way. Plus, if the professor recognizes what you're doing, you get a 0. So in a way, this is akin to the Buddhist concept as well, that we choose our own fate, but we do so unconsciously, not really understanding what we're doing. I gave you a video from Dennett, but I want to say a little bit about the article we have here, and that is that he thinks that a lot of the rejection of determinism is based on misunderstanding what it's saying. That it's what's called a straw man version. In fact, even a person who believes in free will, like myself, has to recognize that our freedom is within limits. I don't think any serious person can say we can do absolutely anything. That I can fly to Tibet by flapping my arms, for example, or that I can somehow go back in time. Freedom, if we have it at all, is freedom within limits of what is logically possible, within what is physically possible. And so, we do we feel imprisoned on earth? Well, no. If there's no body actively limiting our freedom, no jailer, we're not really in jail. The fact is that a concept of freedom really only means that we have at least 2 live options, that we can make a meaningful choice. Our choices are always going to be limited by a variety of factors. What is physically possible. The accidents of our birth. Having been born in 1956, there's no way that I can escape the fact that I'm getting old. Okay. I didn't choose when I was going to be born, right? But we're choosing within limits. Now, your textbook also points out, that indeterminism runs into its own problems. Some people latched onto the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, that we cannot know both the location and the momentum of an electron, say. Free will does not mean randomness. And if we want to defend free will, we don't want to defend the idea that life is absolutely random. We're trying to defend the idea that human beings have free choice. And Kane argues that undetermined free choices would be essentially random. If you think about it, when we make our choices, we make them for reasons. Okay. Now, whether or not that means that we could not have chosen differently is another question. But we need to be careful not to define free will so that it means random, because I don't think it does. I don't think it can. I don't think it makes sense to say. And so really what we're getting into here is the idea of soft determinism. John Stuart Mill argues that all of our actions are necessary. In a way, they're predetermined. But he argues that doesn't mean that there's no place for free will. That we have, to a certain extent, a power to change our character, to change our actions. I'm going to use an example I used earlier. If you've ever known anybody who's had to quit smoking, it's difficult. And it's difficult because nicotine is addictive. But it can be done. I've known people who've done it. I've never actually been a smoker. It never made a lot of sense to me. Put a bunch of ground up leaves in my mouth and set fire to it. But it can be done. Okay, difficult is not the same as impossible. We do have some ability to change our behavior, to alter our character, if we will, if we choose. And so he winds up arguing that this feeling of our being able to modify our own character, if we wish, is itself the feeling of moral freedom which we're conscious of. A person feels morally free who feels that his habits or his temptations are not his masters, but he theirs. I can choose whether or not to indulge in something that I want to do. Who even in yielding to them knows he could resist, that were he desirous of altogether throwing them off, there would not be required for the purpose a stronger desire than he knows himself to be capable of feeling. Basically, my desire to, say, smoke can be overridden by a stronger desire to protect my health. And so, there's a place in soft determinism or compatibilism for a kind of free will. David Hume defines liberty as the power of acting or not acting according to determinations of the will. That while we certainly act on the basis of desires of our own character and disposition, our personality, if you will. And so the causes of our actions are internal and therefore, at least to some extent, within our control. That is the kind of freedom that we have. It can look sometimes, according to Cain, like our actions are predetermined, but in fact we're making one set of reasons or motives prevail over others by deciding, by choosing. We choose between competing desires, competing inclinations. Harry Frankfurt talks about first order desires and second order desires. First order desires are, I want X, whatever X may be. A second order desire is kind of a step back. I want to be the kind of person who would choose. And he regards the second order desires as essential to being a full-fledged human being. A person who doesn't have them, he calls a wanton, who doesn't care about his will, what kind of things he wants. A human wants to be the kind of person who wants certain things. it's only because a person has these kind of second order desires that he is capable both of enjoying and of lacking freedom of will. And so he thinks that the traditional discussion of free will has gone awry by focusing on first order desires and not focusing on second order desires. The fact that we're capable of wanting to be the kind of person who wants to act in a certain way. So he's raising the standard a little bit. That to be a fully human, we need to be able to not just want things, but to want to be a certain kind of person. We alone among creatures, I think, are capable of this level of, I would guess, self-consciousness. Whatever pops in my dog's head that she wants, that's what she wants. She doesn't think about, I want to be the kind of dog who wants this rather than that. I can choose. I want to be the kind of person who cares about all people and not just a person who cares about those who look like me or talk like me or think like me. That's a different kind of desire, one that implies a self-consciousness. And really, it's in that connection that Frankfurt wants to find freedom.